there's this whole narrative that's developed that we're going through some sort of retail apocalypse, that basically every physical store is going to close, malls are going away. It's basically impossible to make money. And I really think that there's a lot of hyperbole behind that. And part of the reason for that is if you actually look at some of this kind of converse statistics on physical retail, there are actually quite a lot of stores that are being opened in the US. And retail store openings are up, were up last year by over 50%. So it's just simply not the case that physical retail is going away. But clearly the pace of store closings has been greater than the pace of store openings. But what is going on really is, and I think this was mentioned by a couple speakers earlier, that the middle is really collapsing. If you look at what's going on in the States, you see price and value-oriented retailers like Costco and TJ Maxx and some of the Walmart and others doing quite well. At the other end of the spectrum on luxury, specialty retail, you also see folks doing quite well. But it's really this kind of undifferentiated middle, this boring retail where we're seeing a lot of store closings and we're seeing a lot of retailers get into trouble. Now, part of the reason for this, and just kind of taking a step back, is, and I think we all know this, and obviously the statistics are different depending upon which market you're in, and I believe Australia's numbers are a little bit lower, but we've had really robust growth in e-commerce for many, many years now. And as you can see from this data, it's starting to moderate a little bit, but clearly the expectation is that retail or e-commerce is going to continue to grow at quite a great rate. But when you add it up, it's still the case that brick and mortar stores are going to remain dominant. Depending upon which source you see, in the US about 90% of all sales are still done through brick and mortar stores. And even if you flash forward some of those predictions about the growth of e-commerce, by 2025 you're still going to have well over 80% of retail being done in brick and mortar stores. So again, this idea that physical stores are going away is just simply not the case. But part of the problem is different categories, different retailers are affected quite differently. So for example, and I'm sure this is true here as well, if you look at e-commerce shares in products that can be delivered digitally, like music, games, books, and so forth, you have e-commerce shares which are 60, 70, 80%. The other end of the spectrum, you have grocery stores where maybe only 1 or 2% is done online, and everywhere in between. So these statistics overall aren't particularly helpful. You really have to drill down into your particular situation. Now, I apologize for this slide because it's quite busy, and I think actually Bernie Brooks made a reference to this. But I think one of the most important things that's happened in the US, and this is data from Deloitte, has been the incredible growth in the effect of digital channels on physical store retail. So the numbers on the left are the percent of brick and mortar store sales that somehow or other started in a digital channel. So this could be as simple as looking up store hours or location, but it also could be order online, pick up in store. But as you can see, close to 60%, we don't have the 2017 numbers in yet, but close to 60% of all physical store sales are influenced somehow in the customer journey through a digital channel. And we've seen several retailers report these numbers as 70, 80%. The right-hand side just isolates mobile in particular. And again, you can see this incredible growth. So in 5 years, we've gone from digital channels basically not having much influence at all on brick and mortar to 60, 65, 70%. It's quite a big difference. Now, this chart tries to put it together. This is Forrester data, so if you're paying close attention, which I hope you are, the numbers won't quite add up with the Deloitte data. But what this tries to do is show the percent, the gray, is the total volume of e-commerce, and then the blue chart is the percent of physical store sales that are influenced by a digital channel. Does that make sense? Just nod, make believe. If you don't understand it, this will help me. Thank you. But what you can see is that digitally influenced brick and mortar sales are actually far, far greater than e-commerce by itself. And I think this is where, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of folks don't really understand the degree to which digital is not so much about transacting online. It's oftentimes more about how the digital channels are influencing a customer journey to a physical store as well. So no presentation about what's going on in retail would be good without including something about Amazon, and I know this is something that's very top of mind in this market. And I think in the US, sometimes we forget, it was only about 20 years ago that Amazon was this little retailer operating out of a dingy warehouse. Well, actually, I don't know if it was dingy, but it makes for a better story, a dingy warehouse in Seattle. And now today, they're this incredible powerhouse influencing just about every aspect of retail. One statistic which I think is pretty incredible, and this is meant to frighten you if you're in Australia. This, again, just US data, but 2016 over 2015, because we don't have the 2017 data, Amazon accounted for more than 50% of all the incremental e-commerce growth in the United States. So if you add up all the online-only players, all the e-commerce divisions of every retailer out there, you add that all up, it's still smaller than how much Amazon grew in 1 year. One more scary statistic. This is the percent of online product searches that start at Amazon. So if I hadn't seen this data, I would assume a lot of online product searches start at Google. Well, actually, Amazon is about 3 times as great as you're 3 times as likely to start a product search at Amazon over Google or some of these other search sites. And I also saw a recent, and I'm not sure what the differences are, but I saw a recent study that actually had this number closer to 50%. So again, you think about consumer behavior just automatically going to Amazon. So brace yourself. It's going to be a wild ride as Amazon really sets their sight on this market. So with this as a backdrop, I think what we find is, a lot of retail is really at a precipice. We've always, in states anyway, we've already seen a few retailers fall into the abyss. We see quite a few that are marching closer and closer, and hopefully for some, there's still a chance to really change some things. And, what I like to say is really, physical retail isn't dead, but what's dead is boring retail. And so the question is really, what do we do with this as a backdrop? So, this is a bit of a cliche to say that we're at a crossroads with this big fork in the road, but I really think, and I would suggest to you that you have to really make some important choices. You can go in one direction, which is to really try to out-Amazon Amazon, to try to compete on price, incredible assortment, incredible convenience, all sorts of technology. And I think in a lot of cases, that's really a race to the bottom. And as a friend of mine says, the problem with a race to the bottom is you might win, or even worse, finish second. Or you can try to really forge a different path. And that's what I'm going to suggest for most people. You really have to think about going in a fundamentally different direction, and what I call choosing this idea of being remarkable. So what I'm going to do in my remaining time, just very quickly go through what I call the 7 steps to remarkable retail. And this is really based upon my time working at places like Neiman Marcus and consulting and writing and just generally pontificating on all sorts of stuff. But one suggestion, because I'm going to go through this quite quickly, is just maybe tick off in your own mind, if you find this relevant, how your particular company is doing on some of these pieces. And not all 7 are going to be relevant for every single retailer, but I think hopefully some of them will be. So the first step I call harmonized. And by the way, I want some credit for changing the Z's or the Z's to S's here just to show how sensitive I am to the local market. Actually, I was told I had to do it, so. But harmonized is really this idea of being one brand in many channels. And this is what, of course, a lot of people call omni-channel. And aside from just being sick of that term, I really don't think it's all that helpful, because to me, omni-channel suggests being everywhere. And I don't think it's important to be everywhere. I think it's to be relevant where customers need you to be. And the idea in harmonized, and the reason I like that term, is this idea of everything you do in the customer experience really working together beautifully. No discordant notes, but everything just sort of singing well on behalf of the customers. And the challenge I've found, and I don't know how true this is in Australia, but for a lot of retailers, the barrier to this is all the different silos. There's a tendency to have the e-commerce channel and a brick and mortar channel, and have different silos of inventory or different silos of customer data, or metrics for the e-commerce channel, metrics for the physical store, incentives, and so forth. So I think if you're unwilling to break down the silos, chances that you're going to be successful with harmonizing the retail experience pretty slim. Just a couple quick examples. In the US, I think Nordstrom is a company that's really done a good job. I don't quite know how they did this, but about 15 years ago, they really embraced this idea of channel agnosticity and really not worrying too much about who gets sales credit, and trying to break down those silos and making investments in data, making investments in technology that have things work more seamlessly. And even though they're in a very mature category and really don't have many new store openings, they've managed to be quite successful, and have really not, they've actually got an e-commerce business that I think is about 25% of their total sales. So they've navigated this transition quite effectively. Another example from the US is Best Buy, as mentioned earlier. I don't know if you know this or not, but about probably 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of people thought Best Buy was going to be out of business. The The sense was that e-commerce was going to totally ruin their business, that customers would go to the Best Buy stores, take a look at the product, get some sales advice, and then go online and buy it for the cheaper price. And in fact, that hasn't occurred, and it hasn't occurred because they not only got really good at digital, but they really thought about their stores as assets, and how do I use a store to do something different and unique and take advantages of the physical location and merge that really well with digital. So really playing on that convergence idea, understanding that stores support e-commerce, e-commerce support stores. Second step I'll call digitized. I call digitized, and I really don't have much time to go into this, but this is just a very simple framework that Cognizant has put together, and it's just really the idea of looking at ways to digitize your business and be digital first, kind of across the board, your operations, product and services, your customer experience. So if I had more time, I'd go into that, but I'm going to keep moving. Third is personalized and curated, and this is really the idea that no customer fundamentally wants to be average, but more important is today there's no reason for a customer to be average. You know, for the most part, you can get anything you want from virtually anywhere in the world, anytime you want it. So the power has really shifted, and now the consumer can really decide what they want and curate an experience essentially for themselves in many cases. Now, one of the problems is, I don't know if anybody knows this film in Australia, so it's a little risky. Thanks for those of you who laughed. Thanks. This is my one laugh line here. So, but what hasn't happened is a lot of marketing hasn't responded to this new world. There's still a tendency, certain exceptions, but there's still a tendency to stick to these mass marketing, one-size-fits-all things that don't really work, but it's what we're used to. So I really challenge, as you see all the shift to digital, whether, from a marketing standpoint, you're really keeping up with the changes. And I'm quite shocked that this hasn't moved more quickly despite the evidence of things like personalized, sorry, let me back up. It's really about, I think, adopting this mantra of treating different customers differently, about getting that deep customer insight and then finding the ways to deploy it in an effective way. Typically, that is done through more personalized marketing, which I think is finally starting to take hold. I feel like I've been in retail a long time. We've been talking about personalization and one-to-one marketing for 20 plus years. I think the technology has evolved, and people are starting to see the payoff where this is actually starting to get the ROI. Another aspect is customized product. I think it was talked about earlier. Some of you may know Mon Purse is actually based out of Sydney, and I used to work at Neiman Marcus, and there was this belief that the high-end handbags really were all about the iconic French or Italian brands, that nobody would buy an expensive handbag that doesn't have that brand name. Well, Mon Purse and a few others are demonstrating that that's not the case, and you can get 2,000 or 3,000 different possible combinations. I don't even understand all the possibilities, but those of you that have handbags probably can imagine all the different pockets and whatnot you can put together, different fabrics and so forth, and actually deliver the same quality of a Gucci or YSL handbag at about half the price. Another area I still think is pretty early, even though it gets a lot of hype, is artificial intelligence. This is a company out of New York I've worked with called FindMine, and they're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to help intelligently change the websites to present items that are more likely to match with whatever the particular outfit is, and they're having success that are better than some of the more traditional ways of doing this. Excuse me. Fourth step I call localized. And this is really the idea, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that increasingly mobile is really not the front door to the store. We don't go online anymore. We really live online. Smartphones are with us pretty much through most of the shopping journey, so it's really about leaning into that. And the promise of course, engaging at the customer much closer to that point of need or intent. One thing I like quite a lot, and full disclosure, they are a client of mine, but Google has put together this thing called micro moments, where they've been studying extensively by category purchase behavior, different customer journeys. They've really bucketed these mobile experiences into four kind of fundamental pieces of the journey. The first they call the I want to know moments, which is really about just kind of doing your research, trying to figure out what product or service you might like. The second is I want to go moments, which is more about getting to where you need to get to, checking store hours, checking locations, checking the route there, that sort of thing. The third is called I want to do moments, And this is more about a project or something a little bit more complicated. Maybe you're planning a trip, putting a recipe together, doing a home improvement project, so it often involves a lot more advice and kind of putting a bunch of different pieces together. And the fourth is the I want to buy moments. Now, I think as retailers, typically, we're really good at the last part, and a lot of our focus and metrics are around conversion and the actual transactional process. But what I think the Google work really shows is if you don't do well further up in the customer journey, you don't even get customers to the point where they're willing to buy. So it's really about dissecting that customer journey, particularly as mobile devices become a more important piece of it, and figuring ways to be remarkable in those moments that matter. Fifth piece I call socialized. Some of this was talked about earlier, so I'll go quickly, but it's really how peer-to-peer and other kind of influencing in social media are affecting the purchase process. And I think Chow mentioned that, for a while, social media was not really seen as that important to actual shopping. But now I think with Instagram and Pinterest and some other places, we're really seeing social media become a more important place to buy. So it's not just about sharing information, it's actually about being an important piece to the purchase process. The sixth I call amplified. And this is really kind of at the center of what I say about boring. As I go around the world, and I did some of this yesterday here in Melbourne, there's a lot of similarity in the way retail looks. A lot of storefronts that look the same, a lot of websites that look the same. You go inside, I won't name names, but I went into two departments. You can probably figure out who I'm talking about. I went into two department stores that are right next to each other, and if I didn't know which brand I was in, it would be very hard to tell, because the brands that are carried, the presentation, the promotions, and so forth look very, very similar. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of just mass marketing that tends to look very similar. So it's always been important to have a unique selling proposition, value proposition, whatever you want to call it. But I think with the competitiveness that we're seeing and the amount of power that rests in the consumer, it's so much more important to really be remarkable and really be intensely relevant at a scale that you can replicate. So what I'm going to do in this part is just really quickly go through a few experiences that are actually physical store that I think are kind of interesting and perhaps taking a quick look at. So one is just simply this convergence between digital and mobile. And I think a lot of customers are coming in, having done their research online, oftentimes are much smarter than the sales associate. So how do you position that sales associate to marry up with the customer better? One way of doing that is using mobile devices to assist in the selling process. New technology in terms of just making the shopping process more interesting, or maybe replicating or emulating some of the things you can do online. This is a thing that Neiman Marcus is doing called Magic Mirrors, where the customer can try on the dress or whatever, and then just by touching the screen can visualize herself in different colors or different patterns. Starting to see a lot more services being introduced to what would be typically product retailers. So this is a Nike Town store where they're doing, you can maybe see, they're doing running classes, yoga classes, and things that not only have the potential to drive incremental traffic, which of course is an issue at a lot of places, but also help sell the products that they're fundamentally trying to sell. This is Saks Fifth Avenue in New York. They did some research on other things that their customers might be interested in, and it turns out things like spa services and so forth were extra incremental opportunities for them. So they're experimenting with a concierge wellness concept in a couple of stores. This also has the advantage of, in many cases, their stores are really too big for what they need to be, so it's taking advantage of excess space in addition to driving traffic and incremental revenue. I don't know how familiar you would be with these, but there's quite a lot of these online-only retailers like Bonobos, Warby Parker, and others that have started to open significant number of stores. I think Bonobos is going to open about 30 stores in the US next year or this year. Warby Parker about 100. And they're really all showrooms. There's nothing to take with, but it's a place to be able to see and try on the product and get some sales advice, and then they ship it to your home. So quite a lot of activity here. This is another kind of showroom. It's called Beta. This is in San Francisco, Seattle, a couple of other places. And it just features kind of the latest and greatest in technology. And so, again, you can't buy and take anything with you. It's just a place to demonstrate the product, talk to a sales associate, see what's new, and then they'll ship it to your home. Probably familiar with Amazon Go, testing cashierless stores. So you check out via your mobile device. I think there's a lot of issues here. still to work through, but it really deals with the pain point of the checkout lines and so forth. So I think you'll continue to see a lot of experimenting here. Whether they'll be able to scale, I think, is another issue. This is the Honey, I Shrunk the Store part of the program, which is starting to see a lot of retailers, and particularly traditional retailers, experiment with smaller formats. This is a Nordstrom concept called Local outside of LA. A typical Nordstrom store is 100,000, 120,000 square feet. This is 3,000 or 4,000 square feet. Doesn't carry any of the products that they're known for. It's really just services, so you get personal shopping and some other things there. I think it has the advantage of maybe getting closer to the customer, getting opportunities to build new stores, and because it's so much smaller and less expensive in places that would otherwise be difficult to find sites or be cost effective. I forget now, somebody mentioned Italy earlier, I think maybe Bernie. I think food in general and the blending of products and food is going to become more and more important. Obviously, some markets, this is already a piece of the equation, but I think more and more people are going to be looking for other reasons to drive traffic, other reasons to make it a more social experience. And then the last example I'll use, so as we've talked about, a lot of retailers are closing stores or shrinking their stores. Restoration Hardware, home furnishings retailer, they're kind of going big and going home. They've decided to offer these, or to open these really massive stores that are 3, 4, 5 times as big as their prior format, and really make them destinations, beautifully decorated, where you can really imagine how their products and services look in your home. There's a pool, there's 3 restaurants. I don't know why you need a pool at a furniture store, but it's really creating sort of these palaces that are really give you very, very specific and exciting reasons to go to a physical location. All right, last step I call radicalized. And the thing that I've really observed as I look at retailers that have not made the transition well is most of them just fundamentally failed to innovate. They watched while the last 10, 15, 20 years of retail happened to them. And I like what my friend Seth says about this. You know, if failure is not an option, then neither is success. And it's really about adopting a culture of experimentation, and as others have pointed out, you know, constantly be willing to test and learn and push yourself to innovate and to figure out what the next great thing needs to be. So I think I'm up on my time. Let me just close with a Chinese proverb that I really like, which is, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And so I hope that you will choose to be remarkable. I hope you will decide to be innovative. And most importantly, I hope you get started. What better time than now? Thank you.